Emperor was still more dissatisfied with our French historians. He could not bear to read any of them. Veli is rich in words and poor in meaning. His continuators are still worse. Our history said the emperor should either be in 4 or 5 volumes or in 100. He had been acquainted with Garnier, who continued Veli and Villeray. He lived in the basement of Malmaison. He was an old man of 80 and lodged in a small set of apartments on the ground floor with a little gallery. Struck with the officious attention which this good old man always evinced whenever the first consul was passing, the latter inquired who he was. On learning that it was Garnier, he comprehended his motives. He no doubt imagined, said the emperor pleasantly, that a first consul was his property. As historian, I dare say, however, he was astonished to find consuls where he had been accustomed to see kings. Napoleon told him so himself, laughing when he called him one day, and settled a good pension on him. From that time, said the emperor, the poor man, in the warmth of his gratitude, would gladly have written anything I pleased with all his heart. The 27th, about 5 o'clock, the emperor went out in his calash. The evening was very fine. We drove rapidly, and the distance to be traversed is very short. The emperor made the servants slacken their pace in order to prolong the ride. As we returned, the emperor, casting his eyes on the camp, from which we were only separated by a ravine, asked why we could not pass that way, which would double the length of our ride. He was told it was impossible, and we continued our way homeward. But on a sudden, as if roused by this word, impossible, which he had so often said was not French, he ordered the ground to be reconnoitered. We all got out of the carriage, which proceeded empty towards the difficult points. We saw clearly every obstacle and returned home in triumph, as if we had just doubled our possessions. During this dinner and afterwards, the conversation turned on various deeds of arms. The Grand Marshal said that what had most struck him in the life of the emperor happened at Eylau, when attended only by some officers of his staff. A column of 4,000 or 5,000 Russians came also in contact with him. The emperor on foot. The Prince of Neuchâtel instantly ordered up the horses. The emperor gave him a reproachful look, then sent orders to a battalion of his guard to advance, which is a good way behind and standing still, as the Russians advanced, he repeated several times, "What audacity! What audacity!" At the sight of the grenadiers of the guard, the Russians stopped short. It was high time for them to do so. As Bertrand said, the emperor had never stirred. All who surrounded him had been much alarmed. The emperor had heard this account without making any observation, but when it was finished, he said that one of the finest maneuvers he remembered was that which he executed at Eckmühl. Unfortunately, he did not proceed or give any particulars. Success in war, said he, depends so much on quick-sightedness and on seizing the right moment. That the Battle of Austerlitz, which was so completely won, would have been lost if I had attacked 6 hours sooner. The Russians showed themselves on that occasion such excellent troops as they have never appeared since. The Russian army of Austerlitz would not have lost the Battle of Moskva. Marengo, said the emperor, was the battle in which the Austrians fought best. Their troops behaved admirably there, but that was the grave of their valor. It has never since been seen. The Prussians at Jena did not make a resistance, as was expected from their reputation. As to the multitudes of 1814 and 1815, they were mere rabble compared to the real soldiers of Marengo, Austerlitz, and Jena. The night before the Battle of Jena, the emperor said he had run the greatest risk. He might then have disappeared without his fate being clearly known. He had approached the bivouacs of the enemy in the dark to reconnoiter them. He had only a few officers with him. The opinion which was then entertained of the Prussian army kept everyone on the alert. It was thought that the Prussians were particularly given to nocturnal attacks. As the emperor returned, he was fired at by the first sentinel of his camp. This was a signal for the whole line. He had no resource but to throw himself flat on his face until the mistake was discovered. But this principal apprehension was that the Prussian line, which was very near him, would act in the same manner. At Marengo, the Austrian soldiers had not forgotten the conqueror of Castiglione, Arcole, and Rivoli. His name had much influence over them, but they were far from thinking he was present. They believed he was dead. Care had been taken to persuade them that he had perished in Egypt. that the first consul whom they now heard spoken of was only his brother. This report gained so much credit everywhere that Napoleon was under the necessity of appearing in public at Milan in order to refute it. After these anecdotes, the emperor proceeded to mention a great number of his officers and aides-de-camp, distributing praise and censure amongst those. As he went on, he knew them all thoroughly. Two of the circumstances which had most affected him on the field of battle, he said, were the deaths of Guibert and General Corbeau. At a Bessières bullet went quite through the breast of the former without killing him instantly. The emperor, after saying a few words to him, was obliged by the violence of his feelings to leave him. The other was carried away, crushed, annihilated by a cannonball at Eylau before the emperor's face, whilst he was giving him some orders. The emperor spoke also of the last moments of Marshal Lannes, the valiant Duke de Montebello, so justly called the Orlando of the army, who, when visited by the emperor on his deathbed, seemed to forget his own situation and to care only for him whom he loved above everything. The emperor had the highest esteem for him. He was for a long time a mere fighting man, said he, but he afterwards became an officer of the first talents. Someone then said he should like to know what line of conduct Lannes would have pursued in these latter times if he had lived. We have learned, said the emperor, not to swear anything, yet I cannot conceive that it could have been possible for him to deviate from the path of duty and honor. Besides, it is hard to imagine that he could have existed. With all his bravery, he would unquestionably have got killed in some of the last affairs, or at least sufficiently wounded to be laid up out of the center of influence of events. And if he had remained disposable, he was a man capable of changing the whole face of affairs by his own weight and influence. The emperor next mentioned Duroc, on whose character and private life he dwelt some time. Duroc concluded he had lively, tender, and concealed passions, little corresponding with the coldness of his manner. It was long before I knew this, so exact and regular was the performance of his duty. It was not until my day was entirely closed and finished, and I was enjoying repose, that Duroc's work began. Chance or some accident could alone have made me acquainted with his character. He was a pure and virtuous man, utterly disinterested and extremely generous. The emperor said that on the opening of the campaign at Dresden, he lost 2 men who were extremely valuable to him, and in the most foolish manner in the world. These were Bessières and Duroc. In mentioning this circumstance, the emperor now affected a stoicism which was visibly not natural to him. When he went to see Duroc after he had received his mortal wound, he attempted to hold out some hopes to him, but Duroc, who did not deceive himself, only replied by begging him to make them give him opium. The emperor, excessively affected, could not venture to remain long with him, and tore himself from this distressing spectacle. One of the company then reminded the emperor that on leaving Duroc, he went and walked up and down by himself before his tent. No one would accost him, but some essential measures being requisite, against the following day someone at length ventured to go and ask him where the battery of the guard was to be placed. Ask me nothing till tomorrow, was the emperor's answer. At this recollection, the emperor, with a marked effort, began abruptly to talk of something else. Duroc was one of those persons whose value is never known till they are lost. This was after his death the common expression of the court and city, and the unanimous sentiment everywhere. He was a native of Nancy, in the department of La Meurthe. The origin of his fortune has been related above. Napoleon found him in the train at the siege of Toulon and immediately interested himself for him. His attachment to him increased every day, and it might be said that they never more separated. I have elsewhere mentioned that I have heard the emperor say that throughout his career Duroc was the only person who had possessed his unreserved confidence, and to whom he could freely unburden his mind. Duroc was not a brilliant character, but he possessed an excellent judgment, and he rendered essential services which, owing to their nature as well as to his reserve, were little heard of. Duroc loved the emperor for himself. it was rather to the individual personally that his devotion was attached than to the monarch. In being made the confidant of this prince's feelings, he had acquired the art and perhaps the right of mitigating and directing them. How often has he whispered to people struck with consternation by the anger of the emperor, "Let him have his way. He speaks from his feelings, not according to his judgment, nor as he will act tomorrow." What a servant, what a friend, what a treasure. How many storms he has soothed. How many rash orders, given in the moment of irritation, has he omitted to execute, knowing that his master would thank him the next day for the omission. The emperor had accommodated himself to this sort of tacit arrangement, and on that account gave way the more readily to those violent bursts of temper which relieve by the vent they afford to the passions. Duroc died in the most deplorable manner at a very critical moment. His death was another of the fatalities of Napoleon's career. The day after the Battle of Rücken, towards evening, the skirmish of Reichenbach had just ended. The firing had ceased. Duroc was on the top of an eminence, apart from the troops, conversing with General Kirchner and observing the retreat of the last ranks of the enemy. A piece was leveled at this glittering group, and the fatal ball killed both the generals. Duroc had more influence over the emperor's resolutions than he imagined. His death was probably in this respect a national calamity. There is reason to think that if he had survived, the armistice of Dresden, which ruined us, would not have taken place. We should have pushed on to the Oder and beyond it. The enemy would then have instantly acceded to peace, and we should have escaped their machinations, their intrigues, and above all, the tedious, base, and atrocious perfidy of the Austrian cabinet, which has ended in our destruction. At the subsequent period, Duroc might still have exerted an influence over other great events and probably changed the face of affairs. Finally, even at a latter conjuncture, at the time of Napoleon's fall, he would never have separated his destiny from that of the emperor. He would have been with us at St. Helena, and this aid alone would have sufficed to counterbalance all the horrible vexations with which Napoleon was studiously oppressed. Bessières, of the Department of the Lot, was thrown by the Revolution into a career of arms. He commenced as a private soldier in the Constitutional Guard of Louis XVI. Afterwards, having attained the rank of captain of chasseurs, he attracted the attention of the commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy by acts of extraordinary personal bravery. And when the general formed his corps of guides, he chose Bessières to take the command of them. Such was the beginning of Bessières and the origin of his fortunes. From that instant, we find him always at the head of the consular or imperial guard in charges of the reserve, deciding the battle or profiting by the victory. His name is gloriously connected with all our great battles. Bessières rose with the man who had distinguished him and shared abundantly in the favors which the emperor distributed. He was made a marshal of the empire, Duke of Istria, colonel of the cavalry, of the guard, etc. His qualities, developing themselves as he rose, proved him always equal to his fortune. Bessières always continued good, humane, and generous, of antique loyalty and integrity, and whether considered as a citizen or as a soldier, an honest, worthy man. He often made use of the high favor in which he stood to do extraordinary services and acts of kindness, even to people of very different ways of thinking from his. I know someone who, if they have a spark of gratitude in them, will confirm my assertion and can bear testimony to his noble, elevated sentiments. Bessières was adored by the guards, in the midst of whom he passed his life. At the battle of Wagram, a ball struck him off his horse without doing him any farther injury. A mournful cry arose from the whole battalion, upon which Napoleon remarked the next time he saw him, "Bessières, the ball was struck. You drew tears from all my guard. Return thanks to it. It ought to be very dear to you." He was thus fortunate at the opening of the campaign of Saxony, on the very eve of the battle of Lutzen, a trifling engagement occurred in which, having advanced to the very midst of the skirmishers, he was shot dead on the spot by a musket ball in the breast. Thus, after living like Bayard, he died like Turenne. I had conversed with him a little before this fatal event. Chance had brought us together by ourselves in a private box at the theater, after talking of public affairs which deeply interested him, for he idolized his country. His last words as he left me were that he was to set out for the army that night and hoped we should meet again. But at the present crisis, said he, with our young soldiers, we leaders must not spare ourselves. Alas, He was never to return. Bessières was sincerely attached to the emperor. He almost worshipped him. He, like Duroc, would certainly never have abandoned his person or his fortunes, and one would really think that fate, which proved so decidedly hostile to Napoleon in his latter days, had resolved to deprive him of his sweetest consolation by thus removing two such valuable friends, and at the same time to prevent these faithful servants from acquiring the very highest claim to glory, that of gratitude to the unfortunate. The emperor caused the remains of these two men, whom he so much esteemed, and by whom he knew himself to be beloved, in return to be carried to the Invalides at Paris. He intended extraordinary honors for them, of which subsequent events deprived them, but history, whose pages are far more imperishable than marble or bronze, has consecrated them and secured them forever from oblivion. The 31st hour days passed, as may be supposed, in an excessive, stupid monotony, ennui, reflection, and melancholy, where our formidable enemy's occupation our great and only refuge. The emperor followed his pursuits with great regularity. English was become an affair of importance to him. He was now near a fortnight since he took his first lesson, and from that moment he had devoted some hours every day, beginning at noon, to that study, sometimes with truly admirable ardor, sometimes with visible disgust. An alternative which kept me in the greatest anxiety. I considered success as of the utmost importance, and I every day dreaded to see him abandon the ground gained on the day preceding, and consequently that I should be regarded as having wearied him with the most tedious labor without having produced the fortunate result I had promised myself. On the other hand, I was also daily spurred on by the consciousness that I was approaching the goal at which I aimed. The attainment of the English language was a real and serious conquest to the emperor. Formerly, he said, it had cost him 100,000 crowns a year merely for translations. And how did he know whether he had them exact, whether they were faithful? Now that we were in prison, as we were in the midst of this language, surrounded by its productions, all the great changes and questions which the emperor had given rise to on the continent had been taken up by the English on the opposite side, and in their works presented so many new faces to him to which he had hitherto been a stranger. It may be added that French books were scarce with us, that the emperor knew them all and had read them, even to satiety, whilst we could easily procure a multitude of English ones altogether new to him. Besides, to learn the language of a foreigner always prepossesses him in our favor. It is a satisfaction of oneself. It facilitates intercourse and forms, in a certain degree, the commencement of a sort of connection between parties. However this may be, I began to perceive the limits of our difficulties. I anticipated the moment when the emperor would have gone through all the inevitable disagreeables incident to beginners. But let anyone form an idea possible of what the scholastic study of conjugations, declensions, and articles must have been to him. It could never have been accomplished without great courage on the scholar's side and some degree of artifice on the part of the master. He often asked me whether he did not deserve the ferula, of which he now comprehended the vast utility in schools. He declared jestingly that he should have made much greater progress himself had he stood in fear of correction. He complained of not having improved, but in reality the progress he had made would have been extraordinary in anyone. The more grand, rapid, and comprehensive the mind is, the less it is capable of dwelling on regular, minute details. The emperor, who discovered wonderfully facility in apprehending all that regarded the philosophy of the language, evinced very little capacity for retaining its material mechanism. He had a quick understanding and a very bad memory. This vexed him very much. He conceived that he did not get on. Whenever I could subject the matters in question to any regular law or analogy, they were classed and comprehended in an instant. The scholar preceded the master in his applications and deductions. But as to learning by heart and retaining the gross elements of the language, it was a most difficult affair. He was constantly confounding one thing with another, and it would have been thought too fastidious to require too scrupulous a regularity at first. Another difficulty, that with the same letters, the same vowels as ours, a totally different pronunciation is required. The scholar would allow of none but ours. And the master would have rendered the difficulties and disagreeables tenfold had he required any better. Besides, the scholar, even in his own language, was incorrigibly addicted to maiming proper names and foreign words. He pronounced them quite at his own discretion, and when once they'd passed his lips, they always remained the same in spite of everything, because he had thus gotten them once for all lodged as it were in his head. The same thing happened with respect to most of our English words, and the master found it best to have the prudence and patience to let it pass, leaving it to time to rectify by degrees, if it should ever be possible. All these defects from these concurring circumstances actually sprang a new language. It was understood by me alone, it is true, but it procured the emperor the pleasure of reading English, and he could, in the strictest sense, make himself understood by writing in that language. This is a great deal. It was everything. In the meantime, the emperor regularly continued his campaigns of Egypt with the Grand Marshal. My campaign of Italy had long been finished. We were always touching and retouching it with respect to its typographical form, the arrangement of the chapters, the division of the paragraphs, etc. The small part of it that remained in my hands will be seen in the course of this work. From time to time, he also dictated separate parts to Messieurs Gorgo and Montholon. To all this work, he added very little exercise, a walk now and then, sometimes a ride in the clash, scarcely ever on horseback. On the 30th, however, he chose to return to our Valley of Silence, which we had long deserted. We were near the middle of the vale. The passage was stopped up with dead bushes and a kind of bar to keep out cattle. The servant, the faithful Ali, dismounted as usual to clear the way for us. We passed on, but whilst the servant was engaged in assisting us, his horse had strayed from him, and when he attempted to catch him, ran away. A great quantity of rain had fallen, and the horse sank into a quagmire similar to that in which the emperor, a few days after our arrival at Longwood, had stuck so tenaciously as to make it doubtful whether he would not remain in it. The servant ran after us to say that he must remain for the purpose of disengaging the horse. We were in a very difficult narrow road, riding one by one. It was not until some time afterwards that the emperor heard us mention to one another the accident of the servant. He found great fault because we had not waited for him, and desired the Grand Marshal and General Gorgau to return for him. The emperor dismounted to wait for them and ascended a little elevation on which he looked like a figure on a pedestal in the midst of ruins. He had the bridle of his horse passed round his arm and began to whistle in air. Mute nature echoed the strains, but only to the barren desert. Yet, thought I, a short time ago, how many scepters he wielded! How many crowns belonged to him! How many kings were at his feet! It is true, said I, that in the eyes of those who approached him, who daily see and hear him, he is still greater than ever. This is the sentiment, the opinion of all about him. We serve him with no less ardor. We love him with greater affection than ever. But now the Grand Marshal and Gorgau arrived. They assisted the emperor to mount again, and we went on. These gentlemen acknowledged that without their assistance the horse could never have been saved. The united efforts of all three had barely sufficed to disengage him. A considerable time afterwards, staring an elbow of the road, the emperor observed that the servant had not fallen, and said they ought to have remained till they had found he was in a condition to come on. They thought he had stayed behind to clean his horse a little. In the course of our ride at several other turnings, the emperor repeated the same observation. We arrived at the Grand Marshal's, went in, and rested there a few minutes. As we came out, the emperor asked whether the servant had passed on. No one had seen him. When we arrived at Longwood, his first question was whether the man had returned. He had been at home some time, having returned by a different road. I may perhaps have dwelt somewhat too much on this trifling circumstance, but I did not so, because it appeared to be perfectly characteristic in this domestic solicitude. The reader will find it difficult to recognize the insensible, obdurate, wicked, cruel monster, the tyrant of whom he has so often and so long been told. N.B. I have mentioned above that I should introduce the fragments of the campaign of Italy which have remained in my hands. Having now arrived at the end of the month, I will insert a few chapters of them. On my return to France, through fatal events which placed me at my own disposal, my motives for retaining to myself alone the fragments of the campaign of Italy, which I had preserved by the emperor's consent, no longer existing, and the detention of my papers by the English ministers, leaving me no means of publishing anything on St. Helena, I distributed some of these fragments, attaching no other condition to their being made public than that of distinctly declaring that they were mere rough drafts, first dictations, which have no doubt subsequently undergone great alterations. Now that the restoration of my papers has enabled me to publish the Journal of St. Helena, I have thought of collecting all these fragments of the campaign of Italy. conceiving that they will not be uninteresting to those who like to compare the first sketch with the more deliberate idea. And particularly, as I learned from the depositaries of the manuscript of these campaigns, that it was the emperor's will that the whole should be splendidly published with maps, plans, etc., and dedicated to his son. And I have every reason to believe that it will still be a long time before the world can be gratified with this publication. I shall therefore insert the little I possess, which is 7 chapters out of 22, either at the conclusion of the months or in the course of the journal itself, if I find it flag. I now present the first of these fragments, Vendémiaire, the Battle of Montenotte, and part of the 3rd chapter on the topography of Italy. Constitution of the year 3, the fall of the municipality of the 31st of May of the party of Danton and of Robespierre produced eventually the fall of the Jacobins and the end of the revolutionary government. Afterwards, the convention was successfully governed by factions which were never able to acquire any preponderance. Its principles varied every month. The interior of the Republic was afflicted by a horrible system of reaction. The national domain ceased to find purchasers, and the credit of the assignats sinking daily lower. The armies were unpaid requisitions, and the maximum alone kept them supplied. The magazines were empty. The soldier was no longer sure even of bread. The recruiting of the army, the laws respecting which had been enforced with the greatest rigor under the revolutionary government, ceased. The armies continued to obtain great advantages because they were more numerous than ever, but they were suffering daily losses which were no means of repairing. The foreign party, supported by the pretext of the restoration of the Bourbons, gained strength every day. The saloons were open, people discoursed there fearlessly. The communications with foreign parts were become more easy. The destruction of the Republic was undisguisedly preparing. The revolution had lost its novelty. It had alienated many interests. An iron hand had severely oppressed individuals. Many crimes had been committed. They were now most vindictively recalled to memory, and the public indignation was daily more violently excited against all those who had been members of the government, filled official situations, or participated in any manner whatsoever in the triumphs of the revolution. Pichegru, the first general of the Republic, had been gained over. He was the son of a laborer of Franche-Comté and had been the minimum friar in his youth at the College of Brienne. He sold himself to the royal party, to whom he surrendered the successes of the operation of his army. The enemies of the Republic had not many proselytes in the army. It remained faithful to the principles of the revolution for which it had shed so much blood and gained so many victories. All parties were tired of the convention. Nay, it was tired of itself. Its mission had been the establishment of a constitution. It perceived at length that the safety of the nation and its own required it without delay to fulfill its principal object. On the 21st of June, 1795, it adopted the Constitution known under the title of the Constitution of the Year 3. The government was entrusted to 5 persons under the name of the Directory, the legislature, to 2 councils called the Council of 500 and the Council of Ancients. The Constitution was submitted to the acceptance of the people called together in the primary assembly. 2. Additional laws to the Constitution. It was a prevalent opinion that the fall of the Constitution of 1794 was to be attributed to that law of the Constituent Assembly, which excluded its members from the legislature. The convention did not fall into the same error. It annexed 2 additional laws to the Constitution, by which it prescribed that 2/3 of the new legislature should be composed of members of the convention, and that the electoral assemblies of departments should, on this occasion, only have to elect 1/3 of the 2 councils. The convention farther prescribed that these 2 additional laws should be submitted to the acceptance of the people and inseparable parts of the Constitution. The discontent was thenceforth general. The foreign party in particular found all its schemes baffled by these arrangements. It had flattered itself that the 2 councils would have been entirely composed of new men, strangers to the revolution, or even partly of those who had suffered by it, and thence it hoped to effect a counter-revolution through the influence of the legislature itself. This party did not want, for plausible reasons, to conceal the true grounds of its discontent. They alleged that the rights of the people were disregarded since the convention, which had been appointed only to establish the Constitution, now usurped the powers of an electoral body by giving to its members of its own accord the power of a legislative body, that it was plain that the convention knew that it was acting contrary to the intention of the people because it imposed on the primary assemblies in the arbitrary condition of voting at once on the aggregate of the Constitution and its additional laws. The convention ought only to will that which the will of the people. Why did it not allow them to vote separately on the Constitution and the additional laws? Because it knew that the additional laws would be unanimously rejected. As to the Constitution in itself, it was preferable, no doubt, to what existed, and all parties were agreed on that point. Some indeed wanted to have a president instead of 5 directors. Others would have desired a more popular council. But in general, this new constitution was favorably regarded. As to the foreign faction, which was managed by secret committees, it concerned itself but little about forms of government which this constitution had to avail itself thereof for the purpose of operating a counter-revolution, and whatever tended to wrest authority out of the hands of the convention and its partisans was agreeable to this party. Number 3, the additional laws are rejected by the sections of Paris, the 48 sections of Paris assembled, forming as many tribunes, to which the most violent orators immediately hastened. L'Arp, Cerisy, Secretel, the younger, Valblanc, Regnault, etc. It required little ability to excite all minds against the convention, but several of these orators developed great talents. The capital was thus thrown into a ferment. After the 9th of Thermidor, the National Guard had been organized. It had been made an object to keep the Jacobins out of it, but this had led to the opposite extreme, and a considerable number of counter-revolutionists were accordingly found in its ranks. This National Guard consisted of upwards of 40,000 men, armed and clothed. It shared fully in the exasperation of the sections against the convention, and the additional laws were rejected throughout Paris. The sections appeared one after another at the bar of the convention. They warmly declared their sentiments. The convention, however, still believed that all this agitation would subside as soon as the provinces should have manifested their opinion by accepting the Constitution and the additional laws. It thought this commotion in the capital was like those riots so common in London, and of which instances often happened at Rome at the time of Comitia. It proclaimed on the 28th of September the acceptance of the Constitution and additional laws by the majority of the primary assemblies, but on the following day, the sections of Paris appointed deputies to form a central assembly of electors, which met at the Odeon. Number 4, armed resistance of the sections of Paris. The sections had calculated their own strength and appreciated the weaknesses of the convention. This assembly of electors was an assembly of insurgents. The convention annulled the assembly of the Odeon, declared it illegal, and ordered its committee to dissolve it by force. On the 10th of Vendemiaire, the armed power proceeded to the Odeon and executed this order. The people collected at the Place de l'Odeon uttered some murmurs and indulged in some railing, but offered no resistance. The degree of the convention for shutting up the Odeon excited the indignation of all the sections. That of Le Pelletier, of which the central place was the convent of the Filles Saint Thomas, appeared to take the lead in this movement. By a decree of the convention, it was ordered that the place of its sittings should be closed, the assembly dissolved, and the section disarmed. On the 12th of Vendemiaire, the 3rd of October, at 7 or 8 in the evening, General Menu, accompanied by the representatives of the people who were commissioners to the Army of the Interior, proceeded with a numerous body of troops to the place of meeting of the section Le Pelletier to carry into execution the decree of the convention. The infantry, cavalry, and artillery were all crowded together in the Rue Vivienne, at the extremity of which is a convent of Filles Saint Thomas. The sectionaries occupied the window of the houses of this street. Several of the battalions drew up in order of battle in the court of the common, and the military force which General Menu commanded found itself compromised. The committee of the section had declared its representation of the foreign people. In the exercise of its function, it refused to obey the orders of the convention. And after spending an hour in useless negotiations, General Menu and the commissioners of the convention withdrew by a species of capitulation without having dispersed or disarmed the meeting. 5. Menou was deprived of the command of the army of the interior. The section, thus victorious, declared itself permanent, sent deputations to all the other sections, boasted its advantage, and hastened the organization necessary for securing the success of its resistance. Preparations commenced for the 13th of Vendémiaire. General Bonaparte, who had been for some months attached to the directors of the movements of the French armies, was in a box at the Theatre Fidel when some of his friends informed him of the singular events that were passing. He was curious to witness the particulars of so grand a spectacle. Seeing the conventional truce repulsed, he hastened to the assembly to observe the effect of this intelligence and to trace the developments and character which would there be given to it. The convention was in the greatest agitation. The representatives with the army, in order to exculpate themselves, loudly accused Menou. The consequences of his want of skill were ascribed to treason. He was placed under arrest. Various representatives then appeared at the tribune. They described the extent of the danger. The news which every moment arrived from the sections showed but too plainly how great the peril actually was. Every member recommended the general who possessed his confidence. Those who had been at Toulon and with the army of Italy, and the members of the Committee of Public Safety, who were in daily communication with Napoleon, proposed him as more capable than any other person from the promptness of his coup d'oeil and the energy of his character of bringing them safely through the present danger. Messengers were sent into the city to seek him. Napoleon, who had heard all that had been said and knew what was in agitation, deliberated with himself more than half an hour on the course most eligible for him to pursue. A deadly war was breaking out between the convention and Paris. Would it be prudent to declare himself to speak in the name of France? Who would dare to enter the lists alone as the champion of the convention? Victory itself would be attended with a degree of odium, whilst defeat would devote the unsuccessful combatant to the eternal extrication of future generations. Why thus devote himself to be the scapegoat of crimes to which he had been a stranger? Why voluntarily expose himself to add in a few hours one more to the list of those names which men shuddered to pronounce? But on the other hand, if the convention should sink, what would become of the great truths of our revolution? Our numerous victories, our blood so often shed, would then be only disgraceful actions. The foreigner whom we had often vanquished would triumph and load us with his contempt. An insolent, unnatural crew would reappear triumphant, would reproach us with our crimes, would indulge their revenge, and rule us like helots by a foreign force. Thus, the defeat of the convention would place a victorious crown on the brows of a foreigner, the seal of disgrace and slavery of the nation. This sentiment, the ardor of 25, confidence in his own powers and his destiny, prevailed. He made up his mind and went to the committee, to which he represented with energy the impossibility of directing so important an operation while subject to the interference of 3 representatives, who in fact exercised all power and impeded all the operations of the general. He added that he had witnessed all the proceedings of the Rue Vivienne, that the commissioners had been chiefly to blame and had nevertheless acted the part of accusers in the assembly with triumphant success. Struck with these arguments, but unable to deprive the commissioners of their functions without a long discussion, the assembly, the committee to conciliate matters, for they had no time to lose, resolved to select the general from the assembly itself. With this view, it proposed Barras to the convention as general-in-chief and gave the command to Napoleon, who thus found himself relieved from the 3 commissioners without their having anything to complain of. As soon as Napoleon found himself invested with the command of the forces destined to protect the assembly, he went to one of the cabinets of the Tuileries where Menou remained, to obtain from him the necessary information as to the force and position of the troops and artillery. The army consisted of only 5,000 soldiers of all descriptions, with 40 pieces of cannon and its sablons guarded by 15 men. It was an hour after midnight. Napoleon instantly dispatched a major of the 21st Light Horse Murat with 300 cavalry to proceed with all possible expedition to the Sablon and bring off the artillery to the guard of the Tuileries. 1 moment more would have been too late. This officer, on arriving at the Sablon at 2 o'clock, fell in with the head of a column of the section Le Pelletier, come in for the purpose of carrying off the artillery, but his troops being cavalry and the ground a plain, the section retreated, and at 6 in the morning the 40 guns entered the Tuileries. Number 6, dispositions for the attack and defense of the Tuileries. From 6 o'clock to 9, Napoleon visited all the posts and places artillery at the head of the Pont Louis XVI, of the Pont Royal, of the Rue de Rohan, in the Cul-de-Sac Dauphin, in the Rue Saint-Honoré, at the Pont Tournant, etc. He entrusted the custody of the guns to officers worthy of confidence. All the matches were lighted, and the whole of the little army was distributed at the different posts, or in the reserve of the garden at the Place Carrousel. The general beat throughout Paris, and the National Guard formed at all the debauches, thus surrounded the palace and the gardens. Their drums carried their insolence so far as to come and beat the general on the Carrousel and the Place Louis XV. The danger was imminent. 40,000 National Guards, well armed and trained, presented themselves as the enemies of the convention. The troops of the line entrusted with its defense were few in number and might easily be brought over by the sentiments of the population which surrounded them. The convention, in order to increase its forces, armed 1,500 individuals called the Patriots of 1789. They were men who, after the 9th of Thermidor, had lost their employments and quitted their departments where they were persecuted by public opinion. These battalions were formed of them, which were placed under the command of General Brouillet. These men fought with the greatest valor. Their example influenced the troops of the line, and they were of the greatest importance to the success of the day. The committee of 40 members, composed of the Committee of Public Safety and General Security, directed all affairs. Bessières was president. They discussed much and decided nothing, while the presence of the danger increased every moment. Some were desirous to lay down their arms and receive the sectionaries, as the Roman senators received the Gauls. Others thought that the assembly should retire to Caesar's camp at the heights of St. Cloud, there to be joined by the army of the coast of the ocean. Others wished deputations to be sent to all the 48 sections to make various propositions to them. During these vain discussions, at 2 in the afternoon, a man named Lafond debouched on the Pont Neuf, coming from the section Le Pelletier, at the head of 3 or 4 battalions, whilst another column of the same force advanced from the Odeon to meet them. They joined in the Place Dauphine. General Carteau, who had been stationed at Pont-Neuf with 400 men and 4 pieces of cannon with orders to defend the 2 sides of the bridge, abandoned his post and fell back under the wickets. At the same time, a battalion of the National Guard occupied the garden of the Infanta. They professed to be well affected towards the convention, and nevertheless seized on this post without orders. On another side, St. Roch, the Théâtre Français, and the Hôtel de Ville were occupied and forced by the National Guard. The opposite posts are not more from 12 to 15 yards asunder. The sectionaries every moment sent women or advanced themselves unarmed and waving their hats over their heads to fraternize with the troops of the line. Number 7, action of the 13th of Vendémiaire. Matters grew worse every moment. At 3 o'clock, Daniken, general of the section, sent a flag of truce to summon the convention to dismiss the troops to threaten the people and to disarm the terrorists. This messenger traversed the post blindfolded with all the forms of war. He was thus introduced into the midst of the Committee of the 40, in which he caused a great sensation by his threats. He was sent back towards 4 o'clock. The night was coming on, and there could be no doubt that darkness must be favorable to the sections, considering their great number. They might creep from house to house into all the avenues of the Tuileries, already strictly blockaded. About the same time, 700 muskets, belts, and cartridge boxes were brought into the hall of the convention to arm the members themselves as a corps de reserve, which armed many of them who had not until then comprehended the magnitude of the danger in which they stood. At length, at 4:15, some muskets were discharged from the Hôtel de Noailles, into which the sectionaries had introduced themselves. The balls reached the steps of the Tuileries. At the same instant, Lafond's column debouched by the Quai Voltaire, marching over the Pont Royal. The batteries were then ordered to fire an 80-pounder at the cul-de-sac. Dauphin commenced the fire and served as a signal to all posts. After several discharges, St. Roch was carried. Lafond's column, the head and flank of which were both exposed to the cannonade from the quay at the point of the Louvre wicket and from the head of the Pont Royal, was routed. The Rue Saint-Honoré, the Rue Saint-Florentin, and the adjacent places were swept by the guns. About 100 men attempted to make a stand at the Théâtre de la République, and a few shells from the howitzers dislodged them in an instant. At 6 o'clock, all was over. If a few cannon were heard at long intervals in the course of the night, it was to prevent the barricades which some inhabitants had attempted to form with casks. There were about 200 killed and wounded on the part of the sectionaries, and nearly as many on the side of the convention, the greater part of the latter at the gates of Saint-Roch. 3 of the representatives, Fréron, Louvet, and Sieyès, displayed some firmness. The section of the 15, Faubourg Saint-Antoine, was the only one that took part in the convention. It furnished 250 men, so completely had the late political oscillations of this body alienated all classes from it. The Faubourg, however, if they did not rise in favor of the convention, certainly did not act against it. It is untrue that in the commencement of the action, the troops were ordered to fire with powder only. That would only have served to embolden the sectionaries and to endanger the troops. But it is a fact that when once they were engaged and success had ceased to be doubtful, they fired without ball.